Let's introduce our guests. Dr. John Kitui is the country director for Oxfam Kenya. He joins us in the studio. A very good morning to you, Dr. Kitui.
Good morning.
It's good to have you on the show. Welcome to the hot seat of the Situation Room.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's been a cold night, so that's why we need to warm it up a little bit for everybody. Tell us about Oxfam. Very many people have interacted with the name Oxfam, but not very many people understand who Oxfam are and what you do.
So Oxfam is a global movement of organizations that are committed to fighting inequality. It's been working in the development and humanitarian sector for many years across the world. And in Kenya in particular, we work in northern parts of Kenya. But also we work with many partners across the country, including in Nairobi. And our main objective is to fight inequality as a way to end poverty and injustice across the world.
Fight inequality.
Mm-hmm. I think you're going to ask exactly what I'm going to ask.
So ask it.
When you say fight inequality, okay?
Yes.
Let's start with the basics. What do you consider to be inequality? How do people define this thing that you want to fight against?
Yeah, so inequality is, I think the inequality that interests us is the multidimensional inequality. So the inequality that many people are used to is the economic inequality, where you get a few individuals have extreme wealth, and then the millions and millions of individuals live in absolute deprivation. So that's kind of the inequality that we know. It's an injustice because as society, we have a responsibility to care for each other. And that's why we come together actually and organize ourselves as nations, is to care for each other, the redistributive as element of government and the government duty to reduce misery. But we live in countries or in contexts or in a world where extreme wealth exists alongside extreme deprivation. And as Oxfam, we think that's an injustice.
Okay, now comes the how. How do people do this? And of course, I'm going to ask, in your opinion, what does success look like once the how has been achieved?
Yes. Yeah. One way that there are many ways of doing it. But one way is just empowering citizens to be able to realize their full life potential. And you can do that through empowering them economically to engage in economic activities as individuals, as households, but also to demand for their rights as citizens. And this could be rights, for example, access to education, access to water, access to health services, the enabling environment for them to engage in agriculture. For example, we see all these droughts going on across the country, food insecurity. It's really working with communities as active citizens to do something for themselves, but also to rise up to hold governments and duty bearers to account as well as part of their own agency to fight inequality in the world.
And success. When you've successfully fought against inequality, what is this picture? What's a picture of this outcome that you anticipate? What will you see happening?
I think fundamentally, what we want to see is a world where there is no misery, where every individual lives in dignity. So for us, I think success really fundamentally looks at the dignity of every human being in the world, and dignity within a democratic society. I think for me that is in a nutshell, and we can expound that, we can flesh that a bit. But the success would really be every individual Kenyan in this country, for example, lives in dignity, and they are not undignified by the way they live. They realize their full potential, but also that government actually serves everybody across the country as opposed to a few individuals.
Are you talking about equal opportunity?
Yes.
Okay.
So equal opportunity, and I think when you talk about equal opportunity, it's about both the equal opportunity, for example, opportunity to jobs, opportunity to grow your food, opportunity to put food on the table, opportunity to thrive, opportunity to enjoy your freedom and everything else, but also it's the preparation to be able to exercise, to take advantage of that opportunity when it shows up. And the preparation is in investment, for example, in education, where we can only prepare every Kenyan to be able to exploit the equality of opportunity if every Kenyan has access to education, if every Kenyan has access to health as well. So we know so many children who are below 5 years are malnourished, and chronic malnutrition impact on people's lives achievement. So if within your first years of life you do not access good nutrition and good health, you can never actually realize your full potential, and you can never catch up as well. And that's why for us as Oxfam, we believe in making sure that universal access to healthcare, universal access to education are very fundamental rights of every Kenyan, to prepare them then to be able to take advantage of that opportunity when it shows up.
Thank you.
Yeah, two questions.
Yes.
Oxfam, in the press release, describes inequality as a form of violence. Maybe explain that. And then the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics released a survey showing that 28.5 million Kenyans slipped into poverty between 2014 to 2018, before COVID. It may be worse after COVID. What's gone wrong?
So let's start with your first question. So we see the increasing extreme inequality as a form of economic violence by the choices, really, that we've taken as a society that facilitates that. And inequality in itself is not a bad thing. It's the extremity of it that is a problem. So when you look at within the 2 years of COVID-19, the rich continue to be extremely rich, both globally, but also when you look at the data at national level, the people at the top, the 1%ers, the 10%ers, continues to actually accrue a lot of wealth. But at the same time, we saw almost 2 million Kenyans slip into poverty. And because of the restrictions, many people lost jobs, many people just lost the ability to put food on the table. And that's the inequality that worries us. It's a form of economic violence. It's because of the nature. And when you dig deeper in terms of the drivers of this inequality, and so, for example, we know that poor people in this country are taxed more than actually the rich. When you look at proportionately, the income that you get as a poor person, you pay a bigger proportion of that to government as tax than the rich. But it's because the government has put in place policies that exempt rich people from paying taxation. And these are tax exemptions, tax incentives. We estimate that about 1.1 billion US dollars are just lost as tax revenue.
Where?
Because of in Kenya only. In tax
100 billion shillings.
100 billion Kenya shillings is lost through.
Figure at 600 be lost.
So when you look at the data, the data that we have is about 1.1 billion. And that is on the conservative side, because there's a lot of other illicit financial flows that happen that, again, perpetuated by the rich people that denies government revenue. So government only collects about 35% of the tax revenue that it can be able to collect. When you look at countries like Seychelles collects about 75% of their tax revenue potential. South Africa collects about 50% of their tax revenue potential. Kenya, we collect only 35%. And the little that we collect, we actually collect increasingly from the poor. So you look at things like the excise duty that's put on things like fuel. The people who produce don't put that on themselves. They just pass it down to consumers. It goes down to the basic commodities. So on paper, the basic commodities are exempt from taxation, but it still comes indirectly that they are paying through taxation through this some of these excise.
And what are these
duties.
exemptions that the rich get?
So from an economic perspective, some of the tax exemptions that they get is to try to incentivize their investments. So when supposedly when the government thinks that by exempting rich people from taxation, then they use that money to actually invest.
Right.
But it does not show that that's actually the truth. Some of the exemptions is, for example, through the double taxation avoidance agreements that we have with tax havens like Mauritius. So, for example, if you're a company registered in Mauritius, you do business in Kenya, all you need to do is you declare your profits, but then the government does not tax you here because you say you'll be taxed in your home.
You're being taxed in Mauritius.
Yes, Mauritius, but then you go there and it's very minimal or zero taxation, for example. But then also there are other illegal ways that governments exempt taxation. So, for example, we talk about transfer pricing, misinvoicing, again, through tax havens, that a lot of corporates that do business in Kenya, create their value and wealth in Kenya, do not actually pay their fair taxation in Kenya because they are registered in jurisdictions with very very low taxation.
Oh.
So those are some of the illicit financial flows that I think if we had policies and strategies and capacity to be able to curb, the government would raise enough revenue that it would not need to go into this debt.
I have to ask you, though, one of the words that you used previously was violence. And just the connotation that comes from that is that if there's a violent act then being committed, then there is also the illusion or the suggestion that a crime has been committed. And then there are certain people who will suffer as a result of this crime. So if we're saying that there's this gap that continues to widen and there's some people who suffer a little bit more than others, then they're disadvantaged when they're all supposed to be equal. That's another word. So if there's that suggestion, then there's a perpetrator. And then how do you bring that perpetrator to book if there's violence that's being meted out on a certain part of the population?
To answer your question, I think the first thing is, so it's an economic violence. It's to be very, very difficult to classify it as a crime,
right,
and therefore to bring anyone to book. But it's because, as I think I can't remember, but someone has said that sometimes you can create actually laws that justify the ill in society. And so some of these crimes would be crimes if we really wanted to have an ideal society, but because sometimes some of these illicit financial flows are legally around. So that people are not committing necessarily an illegality from a legal perspective, but from an ethical perspective, it is not correct.
Sure, but if we're looking at things like crimes against humanity, for example,
yes,
if somebody then, the rights of them to be able to eat, the rights of them to be able to live under proper habitable shelter, for example, I'm not able to access this because I can see this is a direct result of this gap, that I'm having to pay more taxes on every shilling that I earn, and that somebody else doesn't have to do the same. As going as extreme as saying and making it public that, this cannot continue to happen because there's a certain part of the population that suffers as a result of these.
And I absolutely agree with you. So I think the responsibility really is on us as Kenyans to classify it as unacceptable as a society. And I think it's a debate that we as Kenyans need to have. Because at that level then, it becomes, as a society, are we happy that a few have this extreme wealth and they continue to accumulate it, and sometimes through unethical, even if they are legal, unethical means, and then at the same time, in the same country, we have someone who will die today because they have no food on their table.
Exactly.
Because we have an ongoing drought in this country at the same time. So we have to agree, and we have to have this conversation and see, is it ethical? Is it right?
Dr. It's a discussion that we always have.
Yeah.
And in my mind, it seems to be we only have a discussion.
Yeah.
How does an organization such as the one that you had consider getting the Kenyan population, especially those who are poor, from the position where they accept their poverty and quite willing to live with it, and to get to the next stage where they realize that they can actually live better lives and they need to do something about it?
So I think it's a tricky question that you ask. But I think for me, it's at some point we have to agree as.
Are you calling me tricky?
It's the question itself. Like, the question you're asking is
yes.
the question is.
We'd agree in the affirmative. Very tricky.
Yes, it's a very tricky question. But ultimately, I think as Kenyans, we need to want to have a government of the people, by the people, for the people. And we have to have the conversation around. So we're having elections coming up in August this year. How do we ensure that the government we elect, if we have any options at all, is actually a government of the people, by the people, for the people? Because the risk that we stand as a country is sooner or later we'll have the government of the rich, by the rich, and for the rich. So that governments actually exist to put money in the hands of the rich, as opposed to investing in social programs.
You know, I framed the tricky question the way I did.
Yes.
Was because even if you elect this government or these people who will present as this government for, by, and of the people, but the people themselves aren't in a place where they can actually action the benefits that are before them,
Yeah.
they may not benefit as much as they could. That's why I asked. In my mind, there's this Kenyan way of doing things. We accept things quickly, adjust, and literally move on. Literally. If this is a hindrance and you know it's going to block your path, you just find a way around it. That's why I called it accepting your position. I listen to these conversations, I read them, and the thing that amazes me is how people are willing to simply, and I mean accept that, after all, I'm poor. After all, I'm helpless. After all, instead of, actually, I can change this for myself. I can do this, the other. And you know what? They actually do. But the doing is in adjusting to accept even more.
But I have a personal opinion on that as well, and I think probably a few people share it as well. The problem in this country is the middle class. But it's because the majority of Kenyans are addicted to their pay slip that they prefer that stability of at the end of the month they get a pay slip, that they are not willing to actually be active citizens and change things. And so the people who have, and these are the people who are actually hugely affected by COVID-19 with the lockdowns and the job losses and everything else. People all of a sudden realize that we're actually one pay slip away from poverty. So we are literally, the majority of us poor, one pay slip away. If that pay slip doesn't come at the end of the month, you are worse off than the person who lives in the village and have a farm and they have vegetables that they've grown. Mm-hmm. So that middle class is really not politically active, is apathetic. They're the people who prefer the stability of the status quo because the stability assures them the pay slip will come through at least every month.
Yeah.
But that's going to change sooner or later. And I think we are seeing even the political class being cognizant of that shifting. And the shifting is going to come because now we have a lot of young people who are going through their academic institutions, who are graduating with degrees, and they don't have jobs. And those are the people who are saying, can you create as a government an enabling environment for me to thrive as an individual? I've gone to school, I am learned, I have a degree, I can't get a job. The government can't continue as the status quo as used to be. So when you look at the apathy has really been created by the middle class, but also we created a majority of poor people who would live on handouts and everything else. And therefore, we've not really had active citizenship in this country. But I think, for me, I believe that as we are having so many young people going through universities in every corner of this country and graduating, those are the people who are coming on the table, and they're going to change the conversation in this country around who the government works for and who it belongs to and for what purposes. And I think we'll probably start seeing that shift to government of the people, for the people, and by the people.
It's so interesting that you say that, because on one hand, earlier we were talking about the funding of university education, which has been cut.
Yep.
And under the IMF Kenya program, and I think even under this government, the funding to universities has been going down. The other thing that's happened with universities is that we did some engagement with one of the public universities, in fact, a couple. Students can no longer organize the way they used to before. They sign, I think it's a code of conduct or something, and if you're seen to be agitating, you're out. You're out. So the fear of God has been put into so I put it to you that our problem is much deeper than you think, and that our universities may not give us that level of activism unless it's an explosion, because universities are actually creating more conformity.
Actually, Wanjiro, even prior to this promulgation of our new constitution, in the days of the one-party state, if you so much as coughed in the wrong direction of the government, it was the end of you. Exactly. And people still agitated even more.
Yeah.
So
in fact, it was despite and in spite
days,
of.
There was a direct threat to your life.
Yes.
You would die, you'd be incarcerated.
They're still agitated. Yes.
The education system or the subjects taught or the manner of teaching was different. We were engaging with university students and we were asking them...
How exactly was it different?
We were asking them, help us think through debt. because these are economic students and we assume they are on the front of knowledge. The way you change the education system is what is taught. But what came out was this issue of a code of conduct, the weakening of the students' union or co-option of, right? Now, what I'm putting to you is that this government has systematically sought to compromise independent alternative voice. It's done so to the student, the lecturers' unions, the teachers' unions, the student unions, and so we might be in much deeper problems.
What did
than
they
we
answer
see.
when you asked them to take you through their understanding of public debt? Surely the answer can't have been, we can't speak because we've signed a code of conduct.
They gave us, we talked through it, identified the issues. One, we found maybe their understanding of maybe their theoretical underpinnings were very narrow. So we didn't find that kind of revolutionary zeal or transformative zeal that you expect at universities.
So quality
And
of education.
it's also what is taught.
Quality.
And also, when you defund education, what happens? Lecturers start doing side jobs.
Hey, that has been happening for the
For the
longest
so maybe
time.
that's not it. So maybe that's not it.
Yes.
So why are they losing that zeal? Because the universities are where you expect new thought. And then the one
Because
thing
you've
that
commercialized education.
And
Maybe.
we don't have a
Starting with a
strong...
university going to start a business.
Yes.
Instead of running its core business of education, imparting
maybe
education.
that is what it is. So everything has become commercialized.
And we do not conduct research in our universities. It isn't the fulcrum on which new knowledge comes about as a result of research.
Research.
How much research do our universities do?
So
Public or private?
So we are not funding them. We force them to go to think more about commercial interests.
They have not been
It's
forced to
percolating
one,
down to the students.
They have not been forced.
They have been forced. If you don't fund, then you have to survive. You have to survive.
So, Dr. Kitui, let me just ask you the question then directly. We are in debt to the tune of, 8 trillion shillings as a country?
Yes.
Is our public debt driving inequality and poverty as you described it?
Yes, it is.
How?
We've already talked a bit about the borrowing that is a bit excessive, but the borrowing really comes as an alternative to taxation. And I think I've talked already about the potential to tax in this country. That probably I don't need to repeat that. The second way that debt is driving inequality in Kenya is through just really borrowing to make billionaires. So there's lack of transparency, there's a lack of open contracts. This information cannot be seen. Eurobond, where did that money go to? We talk about Aurora and Kimwarer. We talk about the SGR contracts, COVID-19 billionaires. Most of the money we've really borrowed has not gone to the purposes that they were intended. So to some extent, it's increasing the inequality by creating a few billionaires. And of course, if it doesn't go to the intended purposes, then it harms a few people. So it worsens that inequality in that end as well. The third way that debt is really driving inequality is by crowding out social spending. And we've talked about poor investment in health, in education, in social protection, even in the midst of a drought that's ongoing, really ravaging northern parts of Kenya. We would be borrowing actually to do cash transfers to those households. Every individual gets 6,000 every month until the drought is over. But no, we are borrowing. I think there's talk in town now that we want to borrow to rescue a few parastatals, Kenya Airways, and I think KPLC, Kenya Power. So we're really borrowing.
We're giving State House on 1.6 billion.
Exactly.
Extra.
So we are actually borrowing, not necessarily to even support the people who are extremely disadvantaged. We are just borrowing, and that borrowing is very lacks transparency, and it's going to be stolen some of that money. So in that way, we increasing inequality. Also, when you look at the amount of money we are using to just service the debt itself, it's estimated that in the first quarter of 2021, we spent about 241 billion, which is about 67% of the tax revenue that year, to just service debt. Now, that comes at the price of what? Again, social spending on where it will really be deserving. Maybe the last thing I want to say as well is who pays for this debt? I think we've talked about the poor actually proportionately paying a bigger chunk of their income to tax compared to the rich, who enjoy the incentives and exemptions and hiring lawyers and accountants to do aggressive tax planning so that they can expropriate money to tax havens. So really the regressive tax regime makes that the poor people pay a proportionate bigger sum of their money to servicing the debt again,
and yet
which they did not benefit.
They're not the ones who first of all came up with the idea of borrowing, and they did not benefit from
they
the
did not
proceeds of the
benefit
debt.
from it at all. Exactly. So there are multiple ways of, and those are just a few. I think there are a lot of even complex, as Wanjiru was saying. If you dig deeper, there's plenty of ways that really debt is driving inequality in this country.
You've talked about regressive tax regime. And of course, the antidote, especially one of the points that Oxfam champions, is the progressive tax regime. What does that look like? And where is that in place? And how do we get there?
Government policy on taxation has to be progressive. And one way of doing that is just, I think we have smart economists who understand that if you tax oil, petrol and whatever, it will indirectly go to the price of commodities. And maybe they are smart enough to advise the politicians that this is one way of bypassing, so that Kenyans think that actually they are zero-rated bread and sugar, but just tax it indirectly through this. But if you really wanted to make sure that the tax regime is progressive, let's put excise duties on luxuries. People who are buying luxury cars, maybe a third home, jets and everything else, and helicopters for campaigns. Let's tax those one exorbitantly. Because those people,
can afford it.
They can afford it. You do not do any harm by taxing the rich. They do not lose. Maybe they lose the owning a third home and a fifth home, but it allows someone to put food on the table. And I think that's absolutely.
Which countries have progressive tax regimes, and how do we move from where we are? Because the people we are asking to change the tax regime are the beneficiaries.
So unfortunately, on the African continent, we don't have any examples that give us good examples. And I think probably Kenya has a very good opportunity to lead on that. Most of the Nordic countries are globally a very, very good example of what progressive tax regimes are. And you see a lot of very acceptable levels of inequality in those countries. People are generally very, very happy. And you do not find any individual Scandinavian person living in abject poverty because it's socially unacceptable. And everyone is happy, especially the rich, to pay higher taxes to meet those needs.
So that's what I mean. So sorry to just jump in there so we don't lose that.
No.
So there is, I don't think that, unless I don't know, is it possible to actually have no gap at all? No gap between the rich and the poor, right? So you will always have a gap. But we are saying that, are you saying essentially that what we should aim for, what we should strive for is to reduce that gap, number one, and then number two, make living economically then comfortable for everybody across board, whether you have a lot in your pocket or you have a little bit less. Basic things should be comfortable in terms of getting for everybody. Is that what we're saying then would be acceptable?
So when we say extreme inequality is economic violence or bad or unethical and everything else, I think it's not to say that equality is the desired picture.
Right.
Because that now goes into communism, which is completely probably very, very harmful. And I think that's not what we're talking about.
Yeah.
I think we're talking about, in a democratic society, how can we cooperate better from a social perspective? And that coming together as a society. Actually, I think the purpose of government, I think is Daniel Kahneman who has said that the purpose of government is to reduce misery. It is not to increase happiness at all. It's to reduce misery. Why we come together as society is to form governments, put governments in place to guarantee our liberties and our rights. That's partly to reduce misery. You just don't want to be arrested for no reason. You don't want to be constrained to say whatever you want to say. You want to live in and enjoy your freedoms.
Right.
So to minimize that misery, we come together and we form government. We also want equal opportunities. You don't want a few people accessing opportunities and then you don't have those opportunities. That's partly why we form government. And the last thing we form government, when you look at some of the thinking from people like John Rawls, for example, is to make sure that the least advantaged benefit from inequality. So if the least advantaged do not benefit from inequality, then there is a problem and we have to fix it. And the purpose of government is actually to make sure that the least advantaged benefit from inequality. And it's the whole concept of coming together, pooling our taxes, and then making sure that public services work, education, health. We're investing in agriculture. Our economy is 34% GDP on agriculture. Why don't we invest? Why are we borrowing to make sure that we're investing in agriculture, especially we have this drought, climate change, food insecurity.
So what has failed then in Kenya? Is it the concept of government or our government?
I think it's both.
Because all those things that you've said, none of them is ticking the box. We have a government to reduce misery. Huh?
On the contrary. On the contrary.
But it's because we don't have
It's
an
increasing
I think it's
happiness amongst a few.
ideological government. We need to bring in we need to have a few ideologies back into government at least. And I think some of these philosophical conversations needs to come back on the table. Today we form governments not on the basis of any manifesto at all. We form governments purely just because we can get two large tribes to come together and agree among the top people who will be president and who will be the deputy president. So I think we have to shift the conversation. So one of the, I think Muga was talking as Kenyans, and I think I'm talking as
Which
Kenyans.
Kenyans? Because
myself and yourself.
Governments are also Kenyans. They are now arguing about the elections bill because they know what they want. We were saying the electoral system works. It works for the political elite. So which Kenyans are going to front this conversation?
No, you can't say the electoral system works. In a democratic society,
It
you
works
can't say
for
it
those
works.
who benefit from it.
But you can't say then it works. It doesn't work. It's been captured. It's been captured by the elites. So we
how do we
should
change
probably
it?
be
Who is
questioning
we?
if we have a democracy in the first place.
Yes,
Probably we have
a
kleptocracy.
Nope. We have a
Or a
democracy.
plutocracy.
John,
A
we
government
have-
of the rich, by the rich, for the rich.
Klepto is coming up. We talked about kleptonomics, kleptocracy now. Yes.
City, you
And
think
kleptocracy is
you
people
think
who
we
go to
have a
power
working democracy?
to accrue wealth.
Eh? We
There's
have
no question about it.
that word.
We have a working democracy.
No, we are saying we have some form of democracy.
No.
But it's informed by kleptocracy where a few benefit at the expense of the majority.
You know,
Maybe we need to start
let me
become
ask-
comfortable with
let
the
me have
term.
a
failed
Is it working for
democracy.
the
No,
majority?
our democracy hasn't failed.
Why do
You
you
see,
say that?
We are mirroring our democracy with a theoretical democracy in the West. They themselves are questioning their democracy and asking, is this the best way to have a democracy? And here we are, having homegrown our thieving democracy, we are busy questioning whether it works. Of course it works. It works in that the poorer get poorer, the richer get richer, and
And that's how it's
everybody...
intended to
No,
work.
democracy
works.
is
Do
not
the
intended
majority
to
have
do
their
that.
I hear
have
what
their
CT
way?
is saying, that it works. It
Yes.
may not be palatable, but
it
in
works.
terms of its definition,
It works.
as
But
democracy,
is not
it's
intended
working.
to benefit a few.
No.
No.
It benefits everybody. This
Are-
one.
are the majority?
But the majority are losing out. We are saying
What makes you think the majority are losing out?
28.5
Do
million
they know they're losing out?
28.5 million fell into deprivation between
How many million
2014
again?
28.5 million. This is Kenyan
In
National
Kenya. Why
Bureau of
don't
Statistics.
we just add 2 more million to make it
30.
30 so that,
okay.
so that it's
30 million
easier?
Kenyans?
Yes, 30.
Fell into deprivation.
Yes, they did.
Now, what we are seeing, and you like you said in the West, democracy isn't working. But I put it to you,
No, I said they're questioning it.
they're questioning it.
Yes.
What the narrative coming out is because of this inequality, we are seeing the rise of popularism. Because citizens are so disenchanted, they're saying this democracy doesn't work. Let's just get a leader who speaks our language, whatever they look like, whatever kind of criminal
They get us.
background they have. As long as they can speak to that need, we'll vote them in. But I put it to you that those Western countries questioning their democracy are plutocracies. Ours is a kleptocracy. And maybe what we need to do is frame our problem, then we can begin to resolve it.
Jerry, you can cross this
But
thing
think-
as much as you want. Yes.
I think the best way to look at it is the democracy as practiced in practice. Does it compare to what our democracy as conceptualized in our constitutional documents? And I think for me, that's where you see the gap. Because it is assumed in Kenya that one man or one woman equal to one vote.
Yes.
But actually, how we exercise our democracy is that one tribe equal to one vote. Give or take a few individuals who vote counter to that. So the Luos will vote as a block. The Luyas, maybe the dialects will vote as a block. The Kambas will vote with a few blocks. So our democracy really is not about one man, one woman, one equal to one vote. And maybe we should design our democracy around our tribal groupings when it comes to voting as blocks.
Instead
so we
of
need to
trying
find a democracy that
instead
works
of
with
trying
us.
to
Instead of trying to fit it
run
into a
away
model
from
in a
something that
homogeneous
clearly
context.
the folks within this boundary called Kenya cannot seem to divorce, themselves from, because it's not necessary. Look, I think oftentimes we've talked about it with a negative skew. And it doesn't necessarily have to be that way.
No, it's a positive
because
thing
it is a
that
decision that
we
people
have
make
tribes,
based
actually.
on where they're from.
Exactly.
And this is what the thing is, that people are then redefining their democracy instead of trying to fit a square peg into a round hole.
Exactly.
That we don't have to fit into something that has been prescribed by somebody else.
You're spot
that
on.
you can then now make it fit for what you see clearly is a habitual way of doing things.
Yes.
Are you going
So we've
back to
modeled
BBI?
on paper.
It's
on
majoritarian.
Are you going back to BBI?
On paper, we've modeled our democracy to a homogeneous context. So when you go to Europe and everything, I think it's just a homogeneous context. And as you're saying, in Kenya, in Africa, we should be proud of our tribal groupings.
Yep.
Indeed.
It's our community. We should be proud of it. So tribalism has received negative connotations because it's compared to the democracy on paper that Muga is talking about, where it's one person, one vote. But it's not. Why don't we... And we have smart people in this country. Why don't we sit down and actually rethink what democratic way would make sure every person has an equal opportunity to be president in this country by taking the factor of tribe as we think about our democratic process? Because as it is now, the Pokomos you can never dream of becoming a president in this country if you come
Forget
from
it.
forget about it.
Was
Kuria,
BBI
if you come from the Kuria land, forget about
was
ever being
BBI
president
going to solve that for us?
in this country.
It sounds like it's taking us back to that
No,
BBI conversation.
BBI was
BBI
going to
was
solve it.
No. BBI
Yes,
was going to
explain.
make sure that, you see, just like the way Dr. Kitui has explained, has described, Kikuyu, Mount Kenya, 1 vote. Luo, one vote. Kamba, 1 vote. Luya, let's just, for purposes of
Democratic,
argument,
2 votes or 3 or 1.
let's say 1.
Yep.
Okay? But those are the only votes.
how in Guinea?
The Pokomo, 0 vote. The Kambe, 0 vote. The Somali, 0 vote. That's where our problem is. Now, BBI was only coming to recognize those 4 votes.
So it hadn't gone. Yeah.
Actually, I disagree with him completely. Because, I mean, absolutely completely.
For all avoidance of doubt.
Unequivocally.
Yes, not just a little bit completely. Okay. You see, when you talk about opportunity, unless you are going to have a Switzerland kind of system with the cantons where you rotate it, you rotate. You move from there to here. The moment you have an expanded executive, as was suggested in the BBI, the theory of it, the thinking of it, it opens up even the thinking that, there is a chance.
Yes.
Right. That's a good thing.
The perception. No, politically speaking, this is just politically speaking. And politically speaking, because we have grown into coalition, we understand alliances, you then have a situation where somebody can begin, even as they're coming in, to say, when I come into my grouping, the very thing that Dr. Kitui is talking about, it allows and encourages formations of even stronger groups in these areas where people tend to be more democratic with their vote. They realize if we vote as the coast, we have more power than if you are voting as a Kambe, a Digo. You really won't get very far with it. See, the communities that seem to be powerful figure that out. So, as you say, they come as one. It gives them the power. Now, the moment other communities understand this, coalitions will make more sense in this country, and that bargaining and horse trading puts other people or communities that ordinarily wouldn't have been considered into the picture where they can benefit. So, if you're the cause, you say, something.
Theoretically, everything that you're saying, CT, theoretically, perfect.
Actually,
I'll say just the way you keep saying.
Yes.
Unfortunately, you're talking about Kenya.
Yes.
Kenya,
Lack of rule
the
of
people
law.
who are designing that system are coming from those ones that currently have the vote.
But what I'm saying, we've actually
That's
seen
the
happening in this
majority.
country. We've seen it. It began in the Moi era with what they call the district focus.
He's not a
And then,
different
no. I'm giving you a background explanation before I come to the present. But it isn't talked about loudly enough. But the thing that occupies the minds of most leaders is this thing called a tribal balance.
Exactly. And that's what's going on even currently when you look at the alignments.
Yes, there's always it's always being talked about.
So John,
Yes.
what you're saying is, yes, we have a debt crisis and there's need to talk about the economic solutions, but you're saying there's a structural problem that we have in our society. And we have an ideological problem, an ideological deficit, and then also our system of government, of representation is broken. And we need to...
It's not fit for purpose.
It's not fit for
It's not
purpose.
fit for Kenya. I think it's not fit for purpose at all. It's
So
not
we
fit for
need
this country.
we need a discussion, a citizens' discussion this time, not this annoying BBI top-down political jostling. But we need a discussion. But who is we? Who is going to cause? Who's going to start this?
Unfortunately, Wanjiro,
Yes.
unfortunately, if we do not see, we're talking about consequences because that's what it is. What we're seeing around us. This mindset that Kenyans have, if you don't address how you can bring about the formation of a different mindset from a very, very early age in children, this is always my pet subject. Because even if you remove these current leaders, all of them now, and you bring in the next lot, they'll be
The mindset will
exactly
be
the
That's
same.
the problem.
Exactly the same.
But how many people have we seen who are in the civil society and they talked very nicely the way we are having these conversations? Immediately they entered government. You wonder what happened to that person. I don't want to mention any names, but there are people who are very active and very good and talking the right thing.
Systems corrupt.
But then when they went in, and you wonder what
We told
happened.
Wanjiro. The day we elect her to this Wanjiro.
I'll be the worst.
No, actually, no.
I will change my
But I think
number.
you can make sense.
I do not know
you can
you.
make sense from it from a systems perspective.
Yes.
So when the systems are designed in a certain way, they work to produce the results that they produce. These are complex systems. These are
Right.
complex systems thinking, and you can replace the elements in them, but they will act consistent with how the system is structured. And that's why fundamentally, as we're saying, we really need to revisit how we structure the electoral process in this country. It's a very fundamental, basic, foundational thing that if we don't get right, regardless of who we replace, we'll just be same forest, different monkeys.
But then it must
they'll
be
behave the same
a
way.
collective conversation. But even if, because as I look at what CT was talking about, Switzerland and the cantons, when they had these systems of government coming in place, it was collective. Everybody sat down and was part of it, part of the agreement, and there were views that were brought in, divergent or otherwise, and everybody had a place at the table. Because unfortunately right now I think that conversations are happening in silos, and that there is no coming together of sharing of ideas. There is no coming together of a complete agitation, as it were. So people are having conversations here, there, and everything we must do, we should do, we ought to do. But then the actual doing, everybody then retreats to their little covens, and then nobody comes, it's not collective in nature. And so we just continue going round and round in circles, unfortunately.
It's not in the interest of the kleptocracy to have collective discussion. So the provisions of the Constitution on sovereignty and public participation have been totally diluted. Associations and formations of power have been weakened. That is part of the handbook, the dictator's handbook or the kleptocratic handbook, if there's such a thing, is you have to disperse people. But what we are saying is that we need to change. Here we've talked about electoral system, the tax system, and then also we need the collective voice in that. Maybe we encourage ourselves and say the 2010 Constitution was the fruit of a citizen-led process, the Ufungamano process. And we need to go back to that. And it was spearheaded by civil society.
But why did we move out of that, get off that trail so fast?
Maybe we've had gains.
From 97.
Maybe we've had
It's
gains.
not a maybe. We have
have had
gains.
gains.
I think.
We've had
Let's
gains.
give
But
credit
then
where it's due. I
we've
think
had
we've
gains.
Yes.
Do we still
Many.
have that active citizenship that
Maybe
we
it's
saw
time.
in the
Oh,
decade
we
of the
rested.
90s?
See, we had arrived.
Maybe it's time.
We rested, and then the people who are I think we need a new crop of activists. And I think for me, this conversation happening on SpiceFM is a good one, because we need to have this conversation and then inspire a new generation of activists. Because I think the activists who drove that agenda are now part of the system. They are now in government. It's their time to eat, and they forgot about all the good things they were talking about.
Yeah.
So when you look at all the agitators for constitutional change in this country, for things to work differently,
I think
they're all now
you've
part of
answered
the
my
system.
question, Dr. Kitui. we moved away so fast because there was no deep conviction even among those who were agitating for it.
I think there
Because they
was.
got in, they changed the system, but then they should have practiced with everything that they came in, the conviction that they came in.
You know,
But what we've learnt is that systems change people.
Eric
But we
has a
changed
point.
the system in this particular case.
Eric has a point
Our
in
2010
that.
constitution was overhauling the system.
It was disruptive.
Look, you can count the number of people who are part and parcel of that movement who got into power and actually did what they kept saying. You see, and we point them out. Why are we always talking about Professor Kivuto Kibwana?
Yeah.
Like he's the only one.
He lived the talk.
He lived the talk
Yes.
in every way.
Yes. And he's still living the talk.
Anyway, as we
And there are a
conclude-
few others as well that
Yes.
are living the talk. But as we say in our sector, sometimes culture eats strategy for lunch. And the Constitution of 2010 was a very, very good strategy for this country. Unfortunately, the system's culture of this is our time to eat
Has had it for
ate that
lunch.
strategy for lunch.
completely.
And now we want even to massacre it further so that we can.
Oh, because
Just the
we
bones.
need dinner. Thank you very much, Dr. Kitui, for joining us today. We've been talking about this whole issue of inequality in this country and whether our public debt is contributing to widening gaps in inequality and poverty in Kenya. And you've said unequivocally that yes, they are, and we need to all have a conversation about what then do we need to do, first of all, to rein in all these things that are going wrong, tax system, our tax regime, our governance system, our accountability and the systems that are in place for accountability purposes, civil society, constitutional commissions, and active citizens. All these things must align for us to move forward. Asante for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And you're a good person, man. Come again soon and the debate further with CT.
I'll be very, very happy to come. And thanks for Njiro for the invitation. Much
Thank you.
appreciated.
Yes.